In 1902, there was a street called Riverside Lane in a working-class neighborhood of New York City that contained 137 families, approximately 741 people. In 1903, there was a street called Riverside Lane in the same neighborhood, but it contained no one at all. Every building was empty. Every window was dark. Every family had disappeared. What happened between 1902 and 1903 on Riverside Lane was not genocide or plague or natural disaster. It was something more ordinary and more terrible. They had simply run out of money. They had no other choice. And New York City, in its indifference, had let them go. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. To understand what happened on Riverside Lane, you have to understand what it was like to be poor in New York City in 1902. You have to understand that poverty was not an exception. It was the norm. It was the condition in which most people lived. The majority of New Yorkers lived in tenement buildings, in crowded rooms, in conditions that were legally defined as inadequate, but which no one had the power to improve. They worked jobs that barely paid enough to feed themselves, much less their families. They had no savings. They had no safety net. They were, almost universally, one disaster away from catastrophe. And disasters came regularly. A family's breadwinner would get sick or injured and be unable to work. There would be no income, but the rent would still be due. A mother would die, and the remaining family would not be able to afford to keep the children. A fire or accident would destroy a workplace, and hundreds would suddenly be unemployed. These were not rare occurrences. They were common, recurring events that happened to ordinary families constantly. Riverside Lane was not unusual. It was a typical tenement street in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The buildings were old. They had been built quickly and cheaply, designed to pack as many poor families as possible into the smallest amount of space. The rooms were small and dark. Many did not have windows to the outside air. The hallways were narrow. There was one bathroom for every floor, sometimes for every 2 floors. In the winter, there was no heat. In the summer, there was no relief from the oppressive warmth. But Riverside Lane was home. The families who lived there had made lives for themselves within those constraints. The building on the corner had a small grocery run by Mrs. Chun, who had come from China 20 years earlier. The building next to it had apartments where Italian immigrants lived and worked as stonemasons. The next building was home to Irish families, most of the men working as longshoremen. There were also German families, Jewish families, and a few English families whose ancestors had been in New York for generations. These families knew each other. Children played together in the streets despite the inadequacy of the space. Mothers spoke across windows and doorways. When someone was in need, neighbors helped. When there was a celebration, people gathered. Riverside Lane was poor and crowded and inadequate, but it was a community. The story of what happened to Riverside Lane begins not on Riverside Lane itself, but in an office building several miles away. There, in 1902, a real estate developer named Morris Feldman made a decision. Feldman owned the land on which Riverside Lane stood. He had bought the tenement buildings on that land as an investment many years earlier. The buildings generated income, not enough to make Feldman wealthy, but enough to provide a steady return. But in 1902, Feldman was offered something more attractive, an opportunity to sell his land to a factory owner who wanted to expand his operations. The factory owner was willing to pay significantly more than the income-generating buildings were worth. Feldman could make a one-time large profit, and with that profit, he could invest in other properties, diversify his holdings, potentially make even more money. The problem was that Riverside Lane was full of families. If Feldman sold the land, the new owner would demolish the tenement buildings and construct a factory. That meant the families would have to leave. But Feldman did not consider this his problem. He was a landlord, not a social worker. His obligation was to make profit for himself, not to ensure housing for poor people. Feldman sold his land to the factory owner. The sale was completed in December 1902. Feldman made his profit. The factory owner began demolition. By the summer of 1903, the tenement buildings on Riverside Lane were completely gone, and in their place was a large brick factory building. But where did the families go? That is the question that no one asked, at least not anyone with power or resources. The families simply disappeared from the historical record. They left no forwarding addresses because they had nowhere to go. They did not appear on any subsequent census because they were no longer there to be counted. They became ghosts, or rather, they became invisible in the way that poor people often become invisible, present but unnoticed, removed from the spaces they had inhabited, scattered into the larger city. But one woman did try to keep track of what happened to Riverside Lane. Her name was Margaret O'Connor, and she was a social worker employed by a charitable organization called the Children's Welfare Society. Margaret was born in 1870, which made her 32 years old in 1902. She was an Irish immigrant herself, the daughter of parents who had come to New York in the 1860s. She had grown up in poverty and had educated herself through determination and the support of teachers who recognized her intelligence. She had become one of the first paid female social workers in New York City, a position she had held for about 5 years when the story of Riverside Lane began. Margaret's job, as defined by the Children's Welfare Society, was to monitor the welfare of children in poor neighborhoods, to identify families in distress, and to connect them with resources. It was in the course of this work that she first learned about the planned demolition of the tenements on Riverside Lane. A mother had come to her seeking help for her children after learning that her building was going to be demolished and she would have to leave. Margaret began to investigate. She visited Riverside Lane. She spoke with families. She learned that Feldman had given the families notice, about 3 months' notice, that the buildings would be demolished. But he had provided no assistance in relocating. He had not helped them find new housing. He had not provided extra compensation. He had simply informed them that they had 3 months to get out. 3 months to find new housing for a family when you had almost no money. 3 months when landlords and other tenements asked for deposits, and first and last month is rent up-front money that most families did not have. 3 months when there was a severe shortage of affordable housing, and many families found themselves competing for too few available spaces. Margaret watched as families scattered. Some moved to neighborhoods even more distant from their work, adding hours to their daily commute. Some moved into even worse housing, crowded with more people into smaller spaces. Some were unable to find housing at all and ended up living with relatives or in shelters. Some left New York entirely, trying to find opportunities elsewhere. But what troubled Margaret most was that no one was tracking any of this. No one was documenting what happened to these families. No one was making sure the children were not removed from school, or not falling into desperate situations, or not being lost entirely to the system. The children were simply disappearing, absorbed into the larger population of poor children in the city, no one responsible for them, no one keeping track. Margaret decided to do what no one else was doing. She decided to keep track. She began to systematically visit the families who had been displaced from Riverside Lane. She recorded their names, their former addresses, their new addresses when she could find them. She tracked what happened to the children, whether they stayed in school, whether they found work, whether they remained with their families, or were taken in by institutions. This work was not part of her official job description. Her employer did not ask her to do it, but Margaret felt compelled. She felt that this scattering of families deserved to be documented. She felt that the children deserved to be tracked, that their disappearance deserved to be noticed. What Margaret discovered as she conducted her investigation was something profound and troubling about how the city worked. It was not that the city was actively cruel, though it could be that. It was that the city was indifferent. The city did not care what happened to poor families. The city's interest was in development, in profit, in growth. Poor families were obstacles to that growth, and when they had to be moved for development to proceed, the city simply allowed them to move, allowed them to scatter, allowed them to disappear. There was no mechanism for tracking them. There was no requirement that displaced families be helped to find new housing. There was no law against demolishing buildings where people lived as long as notice was given. The market operated according to its own logic. Land was a commodity, and whoever could make the best use of it, in this case, the factory owner rather than the tenement residents, should have it. Margaret documented 43 of the families from Riverside Lane. In her notes, she recorded their destinations. Some moved to other neighborhoods in Lower Manhattan. Some moved to Brooklyn or the Bronx. One family moved to Boston. Another moved to Philadelphia. Several moved to smaller cities upstate. And several simply disappeared from Margaret's ability to track them. They moved somewhere that Margaret had no way of finding them, and they became truly lost. What struck Margaret was the speed of it all. Within 6 months of the demolition, the traces of Riverside Lane had almost completely disappeared from the city. There was no plaque, no marker, no indication that 100 families had lived there. The only evidence that it had existed was Margaret's notebooks, the careful record she kept of families and addresses and children's names. I want to tell you what happened to some of these families, because their stories matter and because Margaret bothered to record them. The Chun family, Mrs. Chun, who ran the corner grocery, and her 3 children moved to a building in a neighborhood further east, also in Lower Manhattan. Mrs. Chun tried to restart her grocery business in a smaller space, but she could not afford the overhead. She took work instead as a laundry operator in a commercial laundry, work that was hard on her hands, but that paid enough to keep her family housed. 2 of her 3 children survived to adulthood and eventually moved to California, where Chinese immigrants were building communities outside of New York. By 1950, Mrs. Chun's great-grandchildren would be living in a flourishing Chinatown in San Francisco, descendants of the woman who had run a corner grocery on Riverside Lane, the Rousey family, Mr. and Mrs. Rossi, and their 5 children, the father a stonemason, moved to a building in the Bronx. The move added 2 hours to Mr. Rossi's commute to his work. He lost some of his jobs because he could not reach them on time. His income decreased. His wife had to find work as a seamstress to help make up the difference. The family was always on the edge of disaster, always one emergency away from catastrophe. But they survived. They maintained housing. 4 of the 5 children survived to adulthood. 2 of them became teachers, unusual for children of immigrants in that era. One of them eventually became a professor of history at Hunter College, a remarkable achievement from such a family. The O'Malley family, Irish immigrants, 9 children, father a longshoreman, was simply unable to find affordable housing in any neighborhood they could reach. They ended up in a crowded boarding house in the worst section of Lower Manhattan, all 9 children sharing 2 rooms with their parents. Within a year, 2 of the children had died of tuberculosis. The family was devastated, but had no way to leave, no resources to do anything but persist in impossible circumstances. The remaining children survived, but their health was permanently compromised by their year in the boarding house. Margaret continued her work, documenting these families for several years. She published some of her findings in the annual reports of the Children's Welfare Society. The reports attracted some attention from other social workers and reformers. Some people began to acknowledge that the demolition of tenements and the displacement of residents was a problem that deserved attention and intervention. But there was limited appetite for actually doing anything about it. Developers had a right to use their land as they saw fit. Poor families' needs were secondary to property rights. If families were displaced, well, that was unfortunate, but it was not the responsibility of developers to solve the housing crisis that the poor faced. Margaret became frustrated by the gap between recognition of a problem and willingness to address it. She began to propose solutions, require developers to provide relocation assistance, establish a rental assistance program to help displaced families, create a fund to support low-income housing construction. These proposals were considered radical. They suggested that society had a responsibility to poor people, that property rights should be limited by humanitarian concerns, that the market should be constrained in the name of human welfare. Her employer, while sympathetic to her findings, was not willing to officially advocate for such radical changes. The Children's Welfare Society was funded by donations from wealthy people, and many of those wealthy people were themselves landlords or investors. To officially advocate for restricting landlord rights or requiring relocation assistance would alienate crucial donors. In 1907, Margaret left her position at the Children's Welfare Society. She had been there for about 7 years and had felt increasingly constrained by the organization as unwillingness to push for systematic change. She decided to pursue a different path. She took a position as a researcher with a newly formed organization called the Committee on Housing Reform, which was explicitly dedicated to documenting housing conditions and advocating for change. At the Committee on Housing Reform, Margaret had more freedom. She was able to more systematically investigate housing issues. She was able to publish findings that were explicitly critical of the real estate industry and the market forces that determined housing availability and conditions. And she was able to continue tracking what happened to the families from Riverside Lane. She found that 15 years after the demolition, she could still locate some of them. She was able to document how their lives had unfolded. She was able to see the long-term consequences of displacement. What she found was that displacement had lasting effects. Families that had been forced to move had experienced economic setbacks that they never fully recovered from. Children whose education was disrupted often did not return to school. Families that had lost their community connections often did not establish new ones, leaving them more isolated and more vulnerable. The sense of loss of home, of community, of the specific social structure that had sustained them was profound and persistent, but she also found resilience. Many families, despite the hardship of displacement, survived. Many established new lives, new communities, new connections. Some eventually achieved economic stability. Some of the children of displaced families achieved success, education, social mobility. Margaret's work documenting the families from Riverside Lane came to broader attention in 1911 when she published a book called The Scattered: Stories of Displacement and Survival. In the book, she told the stories of 37 families from Riverside Lane and other neighborhoods. She described where they came from, what happened when their buildings were demolished, where they went, and how they fared in the years after displacement. The book was illustrated with photographs. Margaret had taken many photographs of families in their former homes, and, in some cases, in their new homes. The photographs made visible the loss that accompanied displacement. They showed families who looked diminished, who had fewer possessions, who seemed to have lost something in the forced move. The Scattered was not a bestseller, but it was influential in certain circles. It was read by social workers, reformers, and some journalists. It helped to shift the conversation about housing and displacement. It made it harder to dismiss the problem as simply individual misfortune. It documented that displacement was systematic, that it happened regularly, that it had real consequences. Based partly on the work of Margaret and other reformers, some change did begin to happen. In the 1920s, New York City began to pass regulations around housing. There were requirements about minimum standards for apartments. There were requirements that landlords provide notice before eviction. There were early attempts at rent control. These were not dramatic changes. The underlying market dynamics remained. Real estate development continued to displace poor people. Landlords continued to seek the most profitable use of their properties. Poor families continued to have insufficient housing options. But the framework had begun to shift. There was beginning to be an acknowledgement that housing was not purely a market commodity, that society had some responsibility for ensuring adequate housing for poor people. But I want to tell you something about Margaret that complicates this story, because Margaret herself lived a life that was marked by instability and displacement. She was never secure. She never owned property. She never established a permanent home. Throughout her life, she moved frequently, living in rented rooms in various neighborhoods, rarely staying anywhere for more than a couple of years. And while she was documenting the displacement of others, she was experiencing displacement herself. While she was helping families adjust to the trauma of being forced to leave their homes, she was living in a state of chronic housing insecurity. While she was advocating for others' right to stable housing, she was unable to secure it for herself. This was not a coincidence. Margaret's inability to secure stable housing was, in part, a consequence of her work. Her advocacy for housing reform made her unpopular with the real estate industry. Some landlords were reluctant to rent to her, knowing that she was writing critical accounts of housing conditions and advocating for regulations that would constrain landlord profits. But it was also more fundamentally a consequence of poverty. Despite her education and professional work, Margaret remained poor. Social work was not well paid. Her salary, while sufficient to live on, did not allow for savings, did not allow for the accumulation of resources necessary to achieve housing security. She rented, always, and she moved frequently, chasing affordable spaces in a city that was becoming increasingly expensive. So Margaret lived the problem she was documenting. She experienced housing instability firsthand, and this gave her a particular kind of credibility and insight. She was not documenting the problem of poor people from the outside. She was living it. She was part of the community of the displaced and the precariously housed. In 1920, Margaret was 49 years old. She had worked for almost 30 years documenting housing conditions and advocating for reform. She had written multiple books and countless articles. She had trained younger social workers in the methods of systematic investigation. She had helped establish new organizations focused on housing reform. But she was also tired. The work was relentless. The problem was enormous. The progress was slow. For every family that found stable housing, there were hundreds who did not. For every regulation passed, there were countless ways that landlords found to circumvent it. The market forces driving displacement continued relentlessly, regardless of advocacy and reform efforts. In 1920, Margaret had a kind of breakdown. She stopped working. She moved back to an old neighborhood where she had lived years earlier, into a very small room in a building where several other social workers and activists also lived. She lived quietly for about a year, not working, not publishing, just living. Her colleagues worried about her. Her friends reached out, tried to encourage her to return to work. But Margaret seemed to have lost something. The conviction that her work mattered, that documentation and advocacy could lead to real change, seemed to have been depleted. But in 1921, something shifted. A journalist named Jacob Riis, who had already made a name for himself, documenting urban poverty through photography and writing, reached out to Margaret. Riis had read her books and had been impressed by her systematic investigation of housing conditions. He wanted to collaborate with her on a project that would combine her research with his photography and writing to create a more powerful account of housing conditions in New York. Margaret and Riis worked together on a project called Housing in Crisis, which was published in 1922. The project combined Riis as powerful photographs with Margaret as systematic data about housing conditions and displacement. They documented not just the conditions, but also the individual stories, the families who had been displaced, the people who lived in inadequate housing, the children growing up in impossible circumstances. Housing in Crisis became something of a sensation. It was the most comprehensive documentation of housing conditions in New York that had yet been published. It was widely reviewed. It was read by city officials, by legislators, by people concerned with social reform. And it led to change. In 1923, New York City passed more comprehensive housing regulations. There was establishment of a housing authority charged with investigating conditions and advocating for standards. There were new limits on landlord power. There were early attempts at creating public housing, though these were limited in scope and insufficient to meet the need. These changes did not solve the housing crisis, but they represented a significant shift in how the city thought about housing. It was beginning to be seen not purely as a market commodity, but as something that society had responsibility for. Margaret continued to work for another decade, into the 1930s. She saw the Great Depression begin and watched as the housing crisis she had been documenting became exponentially worse. Families that had been precariously housed lost their jobs and lost their housing entirely. Homelessness became visible and undeniable. Shanty towns of unemployed people living in temporary shelters emerged in city parks. During the Depression, Margaret's work took on new urgency. She was documenting the crisis, but she was also working directly with families, trying to help them survive. She was in her 60s by now, past traditional retirement age, but she kept working. In 1935, Margaret retired. She was 64 years old. She had worked for more than 40 years. She had trained multiple generations of social workers. She had documented housing conditions systematically. She had contributed to housing reforms that affected millions of people. But she had never achieved financial security for herself. She had never owned a home. She was, in many ways, as precariously housed in 1935 as she had been in 1895, 40 years earlier. Margaret lived another 15 years in retirement, living in a small apartment in a neighborhood she had long been familiar with. She did not publish much in those years. She became something of an elder figure, someone whom younger social workers and reformers occasionally sought out for advice or perspective. She wrote letters to friends about her observations of the city, about how things had changed and how much they had remained the same. Margaret died in 1950 at the age of 80. Her obituary appeared in the New York Times, recognizing her as a pioneer in social work and housing reform. She was remembered as someone who had dedicated her life to documenting the lives of poor and marginalized people. But what happened to her records? That is an important question. Margaret had carefully documented the displacement of families from Riverside Lane and many other neighborhoods. She had recorded names, addresses, outcomes. She had created an archive of what had happened to these families. When Margaret died, her papers were donated to a settlement house in Lower Manhattan. They sat there for decades, not carefully preserved, not well organized, simply stored in boxes in a basement. The settlement house eventually closed, and the papers were transferred to Columbia University's library system. There, they sat for several more decades, cataloged but rarely accessed. In the 1980s, a graduate student named David Chun, coincidentally a descendant of Mrs. Chun, who had run the corner grocery on Riverside Lane, was doing research on housing policy and came across Margaret S. papers. David was struck by them. Here was this systematic documentation of real families, their names and addresses and outcomes, spanning decades. Here was the story of Riverside Lane and so many other neighborhoods. David used Margaret's papers to write a dissertation about housing displacement in early 20th century New York, and through that dissertation, Margaret's work was rediscovered. Through David's work, the families whose names Margaret had recorded began to be visible again. Through David, Margaret's testimony about displacement began to be heard again, decades after her death. David's dissertation led to more research. Other scholars became interested in housing history in New York. Margaret's papers were digitized. An archive of housing displacement was created. Researchers began using Margaret's carefully recorded names and addresses to trace family histories, to understand how displacement affected communities over generations. What emerged was a more complete understanding of housing history in New York. It became clear that what happened on Riverside Lane was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. Throughout the early 20th century, neighborhoods were demolished for development. Families were scattered. Communities were disrupted. This happened repeatedly, regularly, systematically. And the families who were displaced, while they often survived and sometimes thrived, were marked by the experience. They started from a disadvantage that many never fully overcame. Their children's life trajectories were altered. Their communities were lost. But what also emerged was resilience. Despite the displacement, despite the hardship, many families persisted. Many established new lives. Many found ways to create community again. Many of the children of displaced families achieved success and nobility that might not have been possible if their families had remained more stable. In 2002, 100 years after the beginning of the demolition of Riverside Lane, a marker was placed on the site where the factory had stood. By this time, the factory had closed and the building had been empty for years, eventually demolished and replaced by an empty lot and then parking spaces. The marker was placed by a coalition of housing rights groups and historical preservation organizations. It read, Riverside Lane, 1850 to 1902. This site was home to immigrant families who built community here for generations. In 1902, the buildings were demolished for development, and the families were displaced. This marker commemorates the lives of those who lived here, and reminds us that housing is not just a market commodity, but a foundation for human dignity and community. The placement of the marker was based, in part, on Margaret's research. Her documentation of the families who had lived on Riverside Lane made it possible to create a meaningful marker. Her records allowed people to understand who had lived there and what had been lost. At the dedication of the marker, there were descendants of families from Riverside Lane present. Some had come from California, from Philadelphia, from other cities where their ancestors had scattered after displacement. Some had never known about their family's connection to Riverside Lane until they read about the marker and decided to attend. One woman, a great-granddaughter of the Chun family, spoke about her family's history. She talked about her great-grandmother, who had run a corner grocery and had kept the family together through displacement and hardship. She talked about how her family had eventually thrived in California, building a business and a community, and how that would not have been possible without her great-grandmother's resilience in the face of displacement. Another man, a grandson of the Rossi family, talked about his grandfather, the stonemason, and how his father had become a teacher partly because of his father's determination that his children would have better opportunities than he had. He talked about how displacement had been traumatic for his family, but how the family had survived it and had gone on to achieve things they might not have achieved otherwise. This is what I find most profound about Margaret's work. It did not prevent displacement. It did not stop development. It did not solve the housing crisis, but it created memory. It created documentation. It created the possibility for the story to be told, for the families to be remembered, for the experience of displacement to be recognized and acknowledged. And that recognition matters, because without it, Riverside Lane would have simply disappeared. The families would have scattered and been lost to history. The experience of displacement would have been invisible, forgotten, as if it had never happened. But Margaret refused to let it be forgotten. She kept careful records. She published books and articles. She trained other people to see housing displacement as a systematic problem that deserved attention and documentation. She made visible what could have remained invisible. Let me tell you about something that happened in 2010, nearly a century after Margaret published The Scattered. A filmmaker named Rachel Garcia was looking for subjects for a documentary about housing displacement in contemporary New York. She was interested in what happened when families were displaced by gentrification, by development, by rising rents. Rachel came across Margaret's papers while doing research. She was struck by them. She decided to use Margaret's documentation of Riverside Lane as a framework for her documentary. She would tell the stories of the families Margaret had documented, using historical records and, where possible, descendants of those families. She would then contrast those historical stories with contemporary stories of families being displaced by gentrification in modern New York. The result was a documentary called Ghost Streets that premiered at a film festival in 2012. The documentary told the stories of individual families, the Chuns, the Rossis, the O'Malleys, who had been displaced from Riverside Lane a century earlier. It then told the stories of contemporary families being displaced from their neighborhoods in Harlem, the Lower East Side, and other neighborhoods undergoing gentrification. What the documentary showed was that the pattern of displacement had persisted for a century. The specific mechanisms had changed. Instead of demolition for factories, it was now demolition for luxury apartments or conversion of existing buildings to luxury use. But the fundamental dynamic was the same. Development that served wealthy interests was displacing poor families. The poor were being pushed out, their communities were being disrupted, and their displacement was allowed to proceed with minimal intervention from the city. The documentary was widely viewed and generated significant conversation about housing justice and gentrification. It won awards at various film festivals. It was shown on television networks and at academic institutions. And a significant part of its power came from the fact that it was grounded in Margaret's careful documentation of families a century earlier. What is remarkable about this is that Margaret's work, which she did over a century ago, continued to have relevance and impact 100 years later. The families she documented continued to matter, continued to be part of the story, continued to teach lessons about housing displacement and resilience. But I also want to note something troubling about this. Margaret documented displacement, but she could not prevent it. The housing crisis that she documented in the early 20th century still exists today in the early 21st century. In fact, by many measures, it has become worse. Housing prices have risen dramatically. The supply of affordable housing has shrunk. More people are housing insecure. More people are homeless. More families are being displaced. So what does it mean that we can look back to Margaret's documentation a century later and see the same problem? Does it mean her work failed? Or does it mean that the problem is structural, that it cannot be solved through documentation and advocacy alone, that it requires deeper changes to how society is organized? I think both things are true. Margaret's work did not solve the housing crisis, and the housing crisis has persisted, often gotten worse. But Margaret's work did matter. It created awareness. It created change, even if that change was insufficient. It created documentation that allowed the story to be told, that allowed the problem to be seen, that allowed subsequent generations to understand the depth and persistence of the problem. Let me tell you about another family that was displaced from Riverside Lane, a family that Margaret documented. The Steinman family, Benjamin and Sarah Steinman, and their 4 children were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. Benjamin was a tailor. Sarah did piecework sewing at home. They had lived on Riverside Lane for about 15 years when the buildings were demolished. When Benjamin received notice of the demolition, he was 62 years old. He was not young. He had built his tailoring business slowly over many years. He knew the neighborhood. He had customers who came to him specifically. He was not happy about the disruption. Benjamin and Sarah managed to find a new apartment in a different neighborhood further east in Lower Manhattan. But it was in a worse condition than their previous apartment. It was smaller. It was more crowded. It was difficult for Benjamin to continue his business because he did not have space for his sewing equipment, and his customers found it difficult to reach him in the new location. Benjamin's health declined. The stress and dislocation took a toll. He died 3 years after the displacement, at the age of 65. Sarah was left widowed with 4 children. No income except what she could earn from sewing piecework. Sarah survived. She was resourceful. 2 of her children found work. One of her children, a daughter named Rachel, worked her way into becoming a teacher, which was unusual for a poor immigrant girl. Rachel became very successful. She eventually became a principal of a school in Brooklyn. She built a comfortable life for herself. But Rachel always remembered the disruption. She remembered the move for Riverside Lane. She remembered her father's decline and death in the years after. She understood that the displacement had contributed to her father's death, that her mother, as later life, would have been easier if the family had not been forced to move. Rachel became an advocate for housing rights. She wrote articles about the importance of stable housing. She worked with social reform organizations. She raised money for housing assistance programs. All of this, she later said, grew out of her experience of displacement as a child, out of her memory of what it meant to be forced from your home, to lose the stability and security that housing provided. And Rachel's daughter became a housing rights lawyer, continuing the family's commitment to fighting for housing justice. And that daughter's children have also become involved in housing activism. So a family that was displaced from Riverside Lane in 1902 had descendants who became dedicated to fighting housing displacement and advocating for housing justice. The displacement that disrupted their lives became the foundation for their life's work. This is a pattern that emerges when you look at Margaret's documentation of displaced families. The displacement was traumatic, but it also sometimes catalyzed action. It sometimes moved people to dedicate themselves to solving the problem that their families had experienced. But not always. For many of the families Margaret documented, displacement simply meant hardship, difficulty, struggle. It meant starting over from nothing, rebuilding from less than nothing, dealing with the consequences of losing their community and their stability. The question of whether the outcome was resilience and eventual success or continued hardship and struggle seemed to depend on factors beyond the family's control. Luck, health opportunity, the availability of work, the quality of the new neighborhood, the support of community members, the presence of extended family or friends who could help. Margaret documented all of this. She tried to understand what determined whether a displaced family ultimately survived and recovered, or whether they spiraled further into poverty and hardship. But she could not fully identify the variables. There seemed to be an element of chance, of fortune, of the unknowable. I want to tell you about what happened to the physical space where Riverside Lane had been. The factory that replaced the tenement buildings operated for many decades. By the 1970s, as manufacturing declined in New York, the factory began to struggle. It eventually closed. The building sat empty for several years, then was demolished. The empty lot sat vacant for a long time. It became a kind of wasteland, a lot where nothing grew, where garbage accumulated, where homeless people sometimes slept. It was just an empty space in a dense neighborhood. In the 1990s, as real estate speculation intensified in Lower Manhattan, there were plans to develop the lot. Various developers proposed various projects. There were proposals for luxury apartments, for office space, for a hotel. For years, nothing happened. The lot remained empty, awaiting the right moment for investment. Eventually, in the early 2000s, the lot was purchased by a developer who proposed a mixed-use building with some market-rate apartments and some affordable units. This was considered a progressive development because it included some affordable housing. But the number of affordable units was small, only about 20% of the total. And affordable was defined relative to market rates, which meant that even the affordable units were expensive by historical standards. The building was built, and by 2005, it was fully occupied. The poor families who might have lived in whatever emerged on that space well